How risky is it to assume tenants for a property that you're purchasing? Let's talk about it. So when you're assuming tenants and you're an investor, meaning you're someone who's going to be renting out the property anyways, you have to remember that here in Ontario, tenants are protected to not be kicked out of a property that's being used as an investment when somebody purchases. So for example, if you as a purchaser are buying a property and your plans are the exact same plans as the current owner, which is renting out the property, you have to assume that contract and not be able to kick them out for another tenant. That puts you in a very tight spot if the market values have gone up a lot since the original owner got this tenant to live into the property, and that can really make things tight because obviously the market values have gone up and you as a purchaser are expecting a certain amount of rent in order to make sense of that investment. So that can make things a little bit tighter as a number if you're looking at assuming tenants, but it could make the situation better and give you leverage to be able to purchase the property for a cheaper price. And if you're assuming tenants, even though legally all the tenant needs is 60 days notice and proof that you aren't going to be renting it out to any other tenant, that may be a very difficult situation to prove, and it might also be a very difficult situation later on after the deal closes if, let's say, the tenant decides not to leave. Even though after a while, eventually after a certain process is taken, you can evict that tenant, that does not happen without a lot of headaches and a lot of stress. Now let's talk about if you're assuming a tenant as somebody who wants to live in the property. So this is very different than if you're going to be renting it out because you actually have reasons to have this person be evicted, but you have to make sure that you're doing your best efforts to have the property vacant by the time you take possession, because if you don't and the seller is making sure that you close on the property and that it's your job to evict the tenant, sometimes the tenant will ask for compensation of a month's rent, which they're owed if that's why they're being kicked out. And that shouldn't be the responsibility of the purchaser. That should actually be the responsibility of the previous owner to give this money to the tenant. So all in all, these things should be taken care of before you close on the property, because if the seller gets their money on closing and they're no longer in the picture, it might be very difficult to get in touch with that previous owner, and it could just cause a lot more stress for the purchaser rather than having the property vacant and not needing to worry about going through that process and needing to stress about any of this. You also have to expect worst case scenarios if this is the situation, because even though tenants might sign what's called an N12 or an N11 form, which shows that they are going to be evicted even if it's before the closing date or whether it's after the closing date, tenants can give you a hard time if, let's say, they decide to stay in the property and not be truthful on their word about leaving or not be truthful on the form that they signed. Again, these are situations that no purchaser expects but has to be ready for, and really put that into the risk factor when you're putting an offer into these properties, because even though you don't assume that these things would happen, if they do, you have to make sure that at least you have certain plans in place to evict the tenant or take action into making sure that the property eventually gets vacated, and that can really take a lot of your time and money to do so. Always keep in mind that a tenant needs 60 days notice when they're evicting a property, even if the contract is month to month. Make sure that you're putting clauses in offers so that you can protect yourself as a purchaser and not need to be depending on certain things to take action later on once the deal is already closed. So for example, if you need to make a deal conditional upon receiving an N11 form or an N12 form signed by the tenant and the previous owner, these are things that you have to have in place to protect yourself so that you don't have to hope and depend on other people to be doing these things, rather than you take control and you make sure that these certain forms and certain actions are taken prior to you being the actual owner of the property. So a tenant always wants to make sure that the person who's purchasing the property is actually going to be moving in. And if you as a purchaser are planning on being sneaky and just have them evict and then later on find a tenant, if the tenant finds out that this is the case, they could actually come after you as a purchaser, and they can obviously ask for X amount of money, and this would go to courts and things like that. So just remember, the only way that a tenant can legally stay is if the purchaser is actually somebody who's an investor that plans on renting out the property to someone else. The rent will stay the same and everything about the current contract in place will stay as is, because you have to remember, as a purchaser, you're buying a property, But when there's a contract in place, you're assuming that contract, and that contract is not with a person. That contract is with a property. So you have to remember that as a purchaser and not assume that just because you're a new person that the contract wording changes because of that. So as a landlord, you have to remember that if you're kicking out a tenant, even if they are month to month for reasons like selling to somebody who's going to be living in the property, or for yourself who's going to be living in the property, or maybe a family member who's going to be living in the property, you owe the tenant a month's rent, or they can rent the property that you also own as well.